it's meant to be to create a situation where you can replace having to read textbook. So the details are there to be a little more user friendly, so you can go through it in at your own speed and get the main critical points coming out of each of the chapters. So we're going to go through them with some degree of speed today to make sure that people have understood what's going on. Question is, how many of you all were able to go through the presentations? Some feedback would be nice.
Not thoroughly, sir. I still have to cover some of the week.
All right. Still have to, yeah, that I understand that because they were pretty long. I mean, in both cases, it's more than 100 slides per chapter. So I know it looks long, but there's another element or another option that you have, and that is on YouTube, these chapters are put up as audio files so that you can go into YouTube and if you have the capacity, you can rip the file from YouTube and have it as an audio MP4 file that you can listen to, or you can, you know, when you have some downtime, you can go online and listen to it. Or you know, like when you're driving around the place, or you just kind of have a headset on, you can listen to the chapter being read to you by somebody. That might suit your learning style, so that's an option that you have. So that's another element that you can look at. I believe they have up to chapter 6 as audio files, so you can look at that. All right, so let's look at chapter 2. So chapter 1 sort of laid the foundation of the whole thing and introduced the whole concept of leadership in today's context and whatnot. Chapter 2, and feel free to ask questions along the way, and don't let me go forward without you understanding everything. Chapter 2 really is going to be looking at defining relationship in its current context and looking historically at the development of the concept of leadership and how it's perceived, or how the models that have been developed have sort of evolved through history. So it starts with the concept by looking at how leadership has changed in the perception of individuals around us. So if you look at this, leadership is seen at the beginning as a prize. So, and that is something that a lot of people still look at when they achieve positions of leadership in organizations in particular. It's seen as being a prize that they've gotten, some award that, or some you know, some gain that they've made. And being in a leadership position oftentimes comes as a double-edged sword, because you have people who like their leaders and obviously those who don't like their leaders. So that is something that that you have to pay attention to, because the amount and quality of the reaction you get as a leader is going to be something that's critical. Now, a very interesting observation that's made at the last quotation here is that although leadership has been one of the most observed phenomena in the world, it's probably one of the least understood. And that's because everybody looks at leadership from different perspectives and see it differently. And we're going to be looking at some of that type of thing. And one of the situations that we face is that a lot of people try to indicate to you, this is a great leadership program, or this is not. So you have this thing coming up. There are so many programs that exist outside there, including this one that we're looking at here, that everybody is positioning themselves as gurus in leadership, especially leadership in the context of corporations. And you have leadership in education. I'm actually very familiar with the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. That model, I actually did the training in that. And of course, the DAF leadership experience is something that we should, as management, we tend to look at that as well. Drucker is another individual who comes to mind when we look at leadership studies. Are you all familiar with any of these, or have any of you all participated in any of these types of programs before? Or this is your first formal study with leadership? Now, guys, I can't see the chat when I'm presenting.
Yeah,
Sorry to interrupt.
yeah, I have done some leadership training with work. Um,
Yeah,
Daft and Trucker, the names are very familiar.
yeah. And that's one of the places that it tends to come up a lot is at work. Anybody else? Somebody else is making
Oh no, this totally unrelated. Chris Kennedy trying to enter at the moment.
Hi,
Um,
Chris. Thank you for letting me know.
yes,
Welcome.
sir.
You have a question that you wanted to ask?
Who's that?
You, Chris.
No, I'm not Chris. Chris trying to enter at the moment. But I guess he had to accept them or something like that.
Do I? Oh, yes. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Let's see if he made it in. Hi, Chris.
Hey, sir, good morning.
Hi, good morning. Sorry. Somebody, I was kind of in a presentation there, and I didn't see your notification to add.
No problem.
Sorry about that. I was asking actually as you come in one time, I could kind of put you on the spot. Have you been in any form of training, leadership training in the past?
No.
All right. But are you familiar with some of these? If you look at the screen, any of these kind of programs that exist around us, and they could be in the form of participation programs, textbooks, or well, I should say textbooks, but these self-help development books and that kind of stuff. You see them? This leadership study.
Yeah, I'm seeing them, and I actually saw them when I was going through the slides, and that was actually the first time I came across those books.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So the reason why is because it is one of those areas that is quite easily misunderstood, and there are lots of approaches that people tend to want to take towards guiding people to become more effective leaders. All right, and everybody kind of positions it from a very almost like a storytelling approach. If you ever go through some of these programs and read them, you'd see that they're very proactive and experience related. So they're going to be looking at the experience of individuals in programs to kind of illustrate what's going on, the formal studies of it. Now, and the reason for that is because as I said before, the social construct of leadership is different to different people, and that creates a bit of a problem for us because if we're looking at leadership from so many different concepts of so many different social constructions, that it creates a problem to have some sort of definitive idea of what leadership is all about, much less what is good leadership. And we will discuss some of those things. So one of the problems with studying or defining leadership has to do with the fact that leadership is viewed in different countries by different people in different ways, and in different cultures leadership is looked upon as different something. So we're going to explore some of that in this chapter. All right, so one of the things that we require of our leaders is that when problems face us in our societies, we're looking for our leaders to help us find solutions to the problems that we have. So the problems of climate change, globalization, those are the ones quoted in the book. But what about those? What are the current leadership problems or issues that we're trying to get people to address? So in our case here now, we're looking at leaders helping us to deal with the problems of the COVID-19 infection and getting us through this whole situation that's going on. And if we look across the world, fortunately, because of social media, we're aware of what's taking place across different countries around the world especially where they have well-developed social media platforms. You just sneeze. Sorry, guys. Then we're going to be looking at different styles and different approaches that different countries are trying to use. And unfortunately for us here, we tend to be very we tend to be inundated with the leadership decisions that have been taking place in the American environment. And right in that environment, you can see from state to state, from large different large states around the country, you see different techniques that people are utilizing. And of course, we look at the sort of mixed messages you get from the overall leader, the president of the United States, and you kind of wonder what if anything is guiding that person's thinking process. But at the end of the day, what people are looking for is that they're looking for answers to problems that are not simple. And that is one of the requirements of leadership, that we find solutions to problems that exist in our societies that make it easier for us to live our lives. That's what we want our leaders to do. What else do you think leaders need to be able to answer? Anybody? Mr. Khan, I'm acknowledging your message here. Anybody else has any concerns that you think leaders are addressing? All right, let's move on. The problem with that, though, is that when we look at leadership, the problem that we look at is most times leaders disappoint us. And as a result of the number of times leadership has disappointed us, it has developed a lot of distrust, and we kind of like, they're useless kind of situation. So that despair leads to the creation of something called the antivirus, the anti-leadership vaccine. And the reason for that, or what happens in this situation, is that because of this feeling that comes up here, it discourages people who might be capable of dealing with the problems and challenges that we face, being less willing to actually take up leadership positions. And that's a dangerous thing, because it means we end up with people who are willing to take up leadership positions, but not necessarily because A, they know what they're doing, or B, they're doing it for their own selfish requirements. And that's one of the problems that we have when we start to look at leadership. So we tend to by our own behavior, discourage the best people to come in, because we've made leadership to be a very difficult and unrewarding experience for some people. And you might be able to see this in our political landscape here. I mean, the people who get up in Parliament and represent us as representatives of our areas, I mean, sometimes I look at them and I say, well, how the hell they end up there? Because I mean, obviously they're talking a set of rubbish. They seem to be well uninformed about different things, and they seem to be quite very selfish in their behavior about how they go about doing things. And you wonder, well, why is that happening? Why do our leaders tend to be this particular grouping of individuals? And it's probably because the people who may actually make better leaders don't feel as if that this headache is worth their time. And that's a very bad thing, because that means we're going to end up with people in leadership positions who are actually probably going to be more prone to leading to us, not liking what's happening, and not having the kind of experience that we'd like to have. And that creates a lot of problems. So with that in mind, and that kind of background that we're facing, that a lot of people who can potentially be great leaders actually don't make themselves available because they're unwilling to take up that challenge. Let's look at what the research tells us about leadership and what's been going on in terms of things. So the research that was conducted in this textbook and was documented started to look at the type of concepts or ideas that the leadership techniques that were existing in the past kind of gathered the information that was available today. And they're looking at the fact that leadership is different in different contexts. So that when they started to study leadership in an organization, a firm, a business firm that's profit oriented, is going to be different to leadership in a volunteer organization. Let's say you're a member of the Lions Club or the Rotaries Club. The leadership there would be different. So the leadership you might experience in a classroom, and especially if you are looking at leadership in the classroom at different levels of the education system, so you're going to see a different approach to how things are done. So one of the important things that came up in the research, besides the myths that they were able to dispel from it, is the importance of context. Context in leadership is critical because it kind of defines things in the situation that you face. All right. So this is it's raining here, guys. I'm hoping you're hearing me well. Just give me a heads up there, please.
Yes, yes, sir.
All right.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, just as the rain came down, it kind of affected my sinuses a bit. Sorry about that. All right. So far, what we're looking at here is the importance of context and leadership. And different context leads to different circumstances in which or how leadership is dealt with. So let's look at the myths that the research kind of exposed. Leaders are born, not made. Leadership is hierarchical, and you need to hold formal positions, have status and power. These are all the myths that the information that we researched came up with. That to be a good leader, you need to be charismatic. That there's only one way to lead, and it is impossible for you to be a manager in an organization and a leader at the same time. And that leadership just requires common sense. So these are the myths. What are the truths? The first truth that comes up is that leaders are made, not born. So somebody was actually making a point from another class is that even if somebody was born into a potentially, what we'll say, for example, if we look at a family that has held leadership positions in the past, so traditionally the expectation is that like they're dynasty families. I don't know if you understand that concept. Like the Kennedys in the United States, their families have always been looked upon as being where leaders come from. The Gandhis in India, Mahatma Gandhi, Indira Gandhi, Ravi Gandhi, all these individuals have always been looked at as families that when you're born in that family, there's a great capacity for leaders to be born with them. Now, even if you're born into a family like that, you still need to be trained. Right? It's not that you're going to be born with the ability to be able to do that. That's an important aspect because if somebody who's born into more humble beginnings can rise to be a leader, what's stopping any one of us from learning the skills and developing the characteristics necessary to be a leader? And that's what this model is going to start to tell us, that leadership is something that you can learn and you can develop not only the knowledge but the skills and the interest to become a good leader. All right. So the other aspect is that leadership doesn't happen in one place. It happens at different levels of an organization and in different levels of your life. So for example, you have self-leadership, which begins with you taking a proactive role in leading yourself. If you think about in your family, you can take a leadership position regardless of your age in a family to lead things, because age is not a determinant of good decision making and good leadership practice. If you look in organizations, it's important that regardless of where you are in the structure of the organization, taking up leadership roles does not require that you have a position that says you're the manager. or you're the supervisor. Simply taking leadership for your own actions and the actions of those closest to you in the situation that you find yourself in the organization is providing leadership. And leadership is not something that you do all the time. That's another thing that that we're going to see in this particular thing. One of the important things that they identified is that you do not need to be charismatic to be a leader. It's not necessary. It helps. I wouldn't say that not being liked, because that's primarily what charismatic leaders are. They appeal to people, and because of that appeal, they can have an easier time at convincing people and leading people and getting them to do things that they don't necessarily want to do. So charisma is not necessary, but it's useful. And the problem with charisma is that charisma is dangerous, as we're going to see in a number of cases that's coming up. And in our history, we've had a number of people who have been charismatic leaders who, in fact, have proven to be quite dangerous. So, for instance, Peter Drucker talked about the three most charismatic leaders in history up to the time that he was looking at. And he mentioned the names Hitler, Stalin, and Mao. And these were three very charismatic leaders. But what they did was lead us into a lot of suffering and a lot of despair. And that's an important concept about charismatic leadership. So I brought up these pictures here. Can everybody understand or identify these four individuals? There are two of them who are negative, and there are two of them who use charisma as positive. So almost everybody should recognize Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King and Hitler. What about this gentleman here? Anybody recognizes him?
Is that Jim Jones, sir?
Yeah, look like Jim Jones.
That is the Reverend Jim Jones. Yes. Very good. Excellent. And what is he infamous for?
Mass suicide via religious beliefs.
Where?
Guyana.
In Guyana. Very good. Close to home, huh? Right. He started in the States, he ran his stuff there. And the idea is that his was a couple hundred people that he eventually convinced to drink the Kool-Aid, as it was in that case. But just above him is another charismatic individual out of Germany who led the world into World War II. And through his leadership, led a nation to try and annihilate other people and other races in a massive confrontation that led the world through conflict that kind of defined us for the rest of our life from that point on. So charisma has a dark side and it has a light side. So Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King, they led us through social they led through situations of social change, positive social change, to make things better for people. So some people might view their behavior as, like, the British never liked, for example, Mr. Gandhi, and of course they established people in the United States never liked Martin Luther King, which was one of the reasons why he was assassinated, because he produced what's the word I want to say, an uncomfortable position for America. All right. Okay. So moving on, there's not one right way to lead, and as there are as many people that exist outside there are different methods that can be utilized, and your way of leading is going to be influenced first and foremost by the environment that you came from, and it will also be influenced by things like your gender or your sexual orientation, your cultural identity, and of course one of the things that they're going to be talking a lot about here is your value system. And these different contexts will actually create different methods of leading, and there's no one right one to do anything. All right. There is an important distinction between management and leadership. Management is focused on the accomplishment of particular goals and objectives of organizations, and leadership is about getting people to do the right thing and the best thing. But there is no distinction between being a good manager and being a good leader. You can be both. The objectives, however, of leadership tends to be broader and as opposed to management. Management just kind of wants you to get the business done in the most effective manner. But a good leader will make a good manager because the method that you use to get people to be able to achieve the objectives of the organization and the objectives of the wider society that you're working in will actually lend itself to being useful in both senses. This is one of the reasons why a lot of people look towards successful management leaders to become successful leaders in different environments, politics and in social engagements and so on. Those are things that you tend to look around us and see where you might have leaders coming from those different environments. So there is a difference between management and leadership, but there is a serious overlap between the two, and that's something you want to pay attention to, and that's one of the facts about leadership. Okay. So well, a couple more slides that go on to describe that situation. Leadership is a teachable skill, and that's an important thing that we have to understand, because you might be born into a circumstance that provides an advantage for developing leadership, but it doesn't mean that you're automatically going to arrive at leadership skills. You're going to have to learn those skills along the way to be able to do it. So there's no inherent genetic connection between being born with particular characteristics that can make you a leader, but you can be trained in leadership and develop skills along the way. That's another critical truth about leadership, and that's something that this program is actually going to be looking at. So the text then moved on into the concept of trying to define what leadership is. And it's interesting, this was interesting reading because formal definitions of leadership didn't exist prior to the 19th century. And prior to that, the first time it came up was about in the 1300s. And the word leadership emerged in the 1800s and was used in the context of political influence. That's interesting because there would have been leadership that existed in the past, but it wasn't probably called a leader, or maybe it wasn't referred to in formal or written word at that point in time. But there's leadership has always existed. It's just never been formally defined and studied in the past. All right, so by the 1980s, there was an explosion of leadership studies, and that led to lots of definitions being developed, as you can see documented by the number of definitions and the number of publications that started to come up. And early definitions coming out in the 19th century looked at leadership from the perspective of one individual influencing others to control something in society. That's the Mumford definition there. And what I like about, or what comes to mind when I think about Mumford's definition, is the master of puppets comparison. So where you have one person who's controlling the events and people. So you have that kind of string puppet approach to controlling individuals, the master of puppets kind of thing. Probably a concept that you have something to do that comes up with that, and that's a very interesting perception that people have had developed about leadership in the beginning. So now that goes on in terms of contemporary definitions, though, meaning definitions that are arriving in our time frame now really look more at leadership as a relationship that's developed between those in power or those in charge with people working with each other to try and get something done. And that's where the relational model sits now, where we have the person looking at the relationship between leaders and followers, and us trying to work together to get things done. in a particular way or to achieve some goal or objective. So you have that whole master of puppets movement now down to a whole concept of, and that's the kind of spectrum that we're looking at. The master of puppets down to now not about influence but about us working together, contemporary definitions. So how that shift took place over time really had to do with the level of investigation that took place in society into the concept of leadership. So different studies of science, as you can see here, anthropology, psychology, history, and we talked about that in the first one, they started to add to the concept of what leadership is. And as each discipline started to add their 2 cents, basically, the concept of leadership started to get broader and more complicated, and also it sheds a lot of light on how we kind of look at the leadership mechanisms that work around us, and we start to understand more of what leadership is actually doing and how and why it does what it does and why people behave the way they do. So you start to add psychology and sociology and history. We can observe what's taking place. The anthropology studies the impact of our history on our current life and that type of stuff. So this is where we start to use now the scientific approach. Now you have to remember too that in the coming out of the 19th century, the scientific method wasn't really yet invented. So we're going to go through periods where there's very subjective studies that were done until we start to get to the more objective approaches later on in the development of management studies in particular. All right. So what we've come away with is that there's no one definition that is correct and is definitive in terms of deciding what leadership is. And the big thing that we have to come back to is the question here: what is the purpose of leadership? That seems to be the question that helps us to define the contextual elements of leadership, and therefore will give you the best definitions that's one of the things that as a science we like to do. We like to define what something is and then start to explain the methods of getting it done. It's a very scientific method of looking at any concept or phenomenon in our society. So in order to help us to kind of understand leadership in like with anything else, is to make a comparison with something you're already familiar with. And there were these 8 metaphors that were developed here, and we're going to spend too much time with them, but you can see the reason why we use metaphors or comparisons is to try and relate it to something that we already know, to try and make it clear. So like the competitive market metaphor. So competitive market metaphor looks at a situation where goods are competing with each other in the market for market share, and which good becomes the leader in that market is going to develop through some things. So identifying why does this product become a leader is some of the things that they utilize to describe what leadership was. Now you all can read about these, but the one I found that was probably the most interesting was the metaphor in terms of leadership with music, especially music in the context of an orchestra, or as I said, a leadership in an orchestra or symphony. And the one that I felt was really good was the metaphor that was put together by this Dupree person in 1992 about leadership and a jazz musician or jazz band leader. And just look at the things here that it talks about. The jazz band leader must choose the music, find the right musicians, and perform in public. But the effect of the performance depends on so many things: the environment that you're performing in, the volunteered musicians that's working with you, the need for everybody to perform as an individual and as a member of a group, and the absolute dependence of the leader on the members of the band for you to have successful output. Now, I'm a musician and I played in bands, and I can tell you that this is probably one of the best descriptions that I can see in my mind's eye, because I have, having worked with bands in the past, different bands, I can see why bands are so successful and why leaders or leadership in a band is a shared experience. That's why it felt like a good fit. Now, just out of curiosity, is anybody also musical in nature and participated in band activity, or just messes around with music at all? Anybody? There's nobody in class who plays music?
Yes, sir. I play the guitar.
Right. Do you play it
In a,
in a band?
yes.
What kind of band?
My church group.
Your church, very good. That's one of the first places that a lot of music starts, in church. And it can start from a vocal position as well too. That's another aspect. And when you're playing with other people, it's a lot more difficult than when you're playing with yourself. And if you're doing,
Agree.
yeah, and when you're doing performances, there's more dynamic and critical thing there. But do you find yourself in a leadership position in the band, or are you a follower in the band? If you understand what I'm talking about.
I am a follower in the band. I take in our band the bass man does be the leader or the
Right,
keyboard. So
right,
based on what they play, I will feed off of them and I will play accordingly. I play guitar.
right. But you're playing rhythm guitar or
Yeah,
solo,
rhythm.
right? And that's important, because it depends upon the voice, the instrument that you're looking at, because the bass is not something that people will think about as being leading in the band. But a bass player is the solid foundation. So between the bass and the drums, that foundation allows everybody else to sit on that foundation, and therefore develop a sound. And at the end of the day, the success of your performance is really going to be dependent upon your audience reception of what you've done. And that is something else. So there's nobody else who's done any kind of musical development in their lives. No, I would never see more. All right, so that is a metaphor that tries to explain the complexity of what leadership is all about. And I would urge you to read through that example a little bit, and if you at all ever experience playing music with other people or doing anything with other people, like even football, if you think about a football game, where you're playing as a member of a team. I mean, there's the objective of winning the match, but what has to go on in terms of um, the construction of your defense, your midfield, your attack. Those things are all about working together for one common goal. So there are lots of other metaphors that you could utilize to try and develop an understanding of leadership. Because the persons who would lead would be those people who would have that talent. But they can't only have talent, they have to have the ability to motivate others to do things beyond what they're capable of doing, or beyond what they thought they're capable of doing. That's an important thing that you want to look at too. All right, so another element here in the definition that came up on definitions of leadership is the concept that leadership is episodial, meaning that leadership is not something that's all pervasive and is happening at all moments in time. Rather, it's taking place a little bit here and a little bit there, and it's time specific and it's context specific. So when you go to work, for example, it doesn't mean as soon as you land in the office, leadership is there and present. No, don't work that way. But you might land there, line with the folks, have a cup of coffee, chat a little bit, and then that could include the so-called boss or manager being there as well. But he's not practicing any kind of, he's just asking, hey, how's your day, how's your weekend, that kind of stuff. That is supporting his leadership position or her leadership position. But that socialization helps to put it in context. But let's say um, after 10 o'clock, say we want to have a short meeting about something. That is leadership. That's leadership taking place in that time, and it's in a particular context, and it's about something specific. The meeting finishes and you go back to your desk or your cubicle or wherever you're going to start working on your specific responsibilities. that is not leadership. That is you being influenced by leadership, but the actual leadership aspect that was taking place is gone. So this was another interesting thing. And leadership is not a constant force that is pressing on you, but it is episodial. And I like this particular idea because it means that a lot of times people think about leadership as a constant force on them, but it's not. It's really about moments of significant leadership opportunities or leadership timeframes. So from a leader perspective, from the leader themselves, they can get burnt out if they have to be exercising leadership practice too much. And similarly, the people who are um, the followers can burn out if there's too much pressure on you at all points in time. We don't like it when your supervisor breathing down your neck for every you finished that yet? You finished that yet? We hate that shit. Sorry, my sorry, forgive me of the French there, because you don't want somebody micromanaging. That's the term I want to use, because you need some time to be to be able to think and get things clear in your mind about what you're doing. And if somebody's micromanaging you, it puts an abnormal amount of pressure on you, and that is leadership poorly exercised, I would say, and does give you freedom. So this episodial nature of management is a really nice metaphorical definition. It's not something that's constantly on you or shouldn't be constantly on you, and it's just periods of time throughout the day, throughout the week, that leadership is impacting upon your life. So that's what this element is talking about in terms of the episodial nature of leadership. It's a little bit here, a little bit there, and that kind of stuff. The theories of leadership now. This chapter started to look at the theories, and one of the things that they started off by identifying is that leadership is a complex and elusive phenomenon. Elusive meaning that it's not easy to nail down, and it's not simple to look at. It's not just a one and done step and stage, and it's made up of vast, different multidisciplinary activities. It's about socialization, it's about intellect, it's about knowledge, it's about actions reinforced by words, and all sorts of different things that we're going to be looking at here. So in essence, what might have been thought as being very simple is actually the research is indicating that it's quite a complicated thing. So these are the theories that this text kind of focused on. There were 7 of the major developments through time that they looked at: the great man approach, the trait approach, the influence approach, the reciprocal leadership approach, behavioral approaches, chaos theory, and situational contingency. So we kind of go down the left and then come across to the right. So let's look first off the great man approach, and this is probably one of the first systems or theories that existed that spoke about the leader being a great person. And it actually came from the background of the Darwinistic thinking that kind of dominated the early 1900s. Anybody's familiar with Darwin and what Darwin is famous for, I should say?
Yeah, evolution.
The evolutionary theory.
Evolution.
So the great man theory, therefore, is evolutionary based, meaning that through the background and development of that individual, they become a great person, great man approach. Yeah? Would you agree with that? That was Mr. Khan, I believe.
Yeah, well, the experiences you go through can push you in that direction, but it's not necessarily what will always work.
Right, but my whole point was being at the time, remember Darwin said the species that survived was because it was able to overcome the environment.
Yeah, survival of the fittest and all of that. Yeah.
Right. So that the leader was in essence the survivor, the great man who was able to withstand all the other elements to be able to become this great person. So that and therefore it was a hereditary thing, because that's the other part of Darwin's thinking, that the species would only survive the if they adapted to the environment and would pass those hereditary properties on to the next person. So this is where this whole concept of leadership is born, not made, understand, comes from. Right? So this is where that thinking process of that idea comes from. So the great man approach was probably one of the first things that we started to look at in terms of leadership. The problem, of course, is that it was especially applied to the situations where um, great men existed, and then they had to pass that through blood, through heritage, on to the next generation. And that then led to a lot of intermarriage and stuff like that. And this was something that you saw, particularly the Middle Ages, when you start to see people um, intermarrying. This had to do with the aristocracy and that class superiority to one class of individuals to another class of individuals, and that mixing of bloods and stuff like that makes them weak and whatnot. Concepts that you might be familiar with if you look at that films like Titanic, for example, comes to mind with that, and different films will come up with that. But you notice also that if there were circumstances in which it challenged that thinking, for example, the existence of Joan of Arc and Catherine the Great. These are just two that the text talked about. There are a host of others. It didn't. It ignored the great women in our past. So you have to include people like Elizabeth the First and the Second, Queen Mary, and all those kind of people. Um, they just ignored them. These were just aberrations that took place. All right. So again, the idea is the great man theory was that if this person was great, they had the traits, they would pass those traits on to the next person in their family and that family. So this is the whole concept of leadership being born, kind of thing. Then in the 1900s, they started to develop the trait approach. Now, in the trait approach, the idea was that great men have specific traits, and those traits are very specific to the approach of leadership, and therefore once you have those traits you become a great person. So what are those kind of traits they started to talk about? They started to talk about your intelligence, your height, the amount of self-confidence that you had, whether you had blue eyes or brown eyes. All sorts of ridiculous things were being identified as what makes a great leader. The problem with this well, I should say one of the problems with great man theory was if you perceive that, then you get to a point where there's a finite number of people with whom you can marry. And which was one of the reasons why a lot of royal families in the past started to suffer um, from inbreeding. And that actually started to weaken their genetic structure. So there were a lot of kings and, well, princes and princesses who were born with big genetic defects because of inbreeding, breeding, having children with people too close to you in your family line could cause problems with genetics there. Now, the fallout with this particular theory, with the trait theory, was that we were never really able to come up with a list of definitive characteristics that individuals must have in order to be a great leader, and that actually put into this particular thing. So that policy actually kind of fell apart after a while because there was never a list that they could really put together and say definitively, if you had this, then you'll be a great leader. Never came up. They were never able to do it. Okay, so that then started to lead to the early behavioral approaches. This was where what they were doing was basically trying to look at the behaviors of good managers or good leaders and bad leaders and start to observe the differences in their approaches, and that helped to determine what behaviors were good or would lead to better leadership decisions and those that would lead to bad ones, and develop that comparative thing. Initially started off being rather subjective in nature, but it did lead the beginning of the behaviorists starting to get involved in observing a phenomenon that needed some investigation. So yeah, the 50s and 60s being there. Um, Two studies that came up, the Ohio and Michigan, University of Michigan study came up with two behaviors that they considered very important for good leaders is and they were able to define it as consideration and initiating structures. So basically consideration was the degree to which a leader showed consideration for the individuality and the human part of the individuals that they were leading. And initiating structure, the degree in which the structure in which you are operating facilitated the ability to achieve goals. So if you're working in a restrictive environment, then that structure will not lend itself to the accomplishment of the goal, especially in organizations and businesses. But if you set up a structure that made it relatively easy and straightforward for the organization and the individuals to achieve the goals of the organization, then those two that would lead to better opportunities for you to become successful as a leader and as an organization. Now, the two dimensions, consideration for the employee and the structure in which they're working, they were measured as two separate dimensions. And based upon how a leader scored in the two, then they were determined as whether or not they were good leaders or bad leaders. Or they came down to these two things were necessary for you to pay attention to be able to become a more effective leader. So the idea would be is that the problem that started to come up was that people who scored negative in consideration but scored high in initiating structure were still being given good scores as leaders. And therefore, the relationship between the two wasn't really seen or wasn't being exhibited. Again, it had to do with the way in which that information was being gathered. Now, another model that came up was the two-factor approach, concern for people, concern for production. So you see here now that again, it's a beginning structure, and they're saying that two main factors. If the leader is concerned about people, they have to have a great concern for the persons or the individuals that are working with them, as well as their concern for the production output. So the combination of the two of them and how much capacity you had to show concern as well as show concern for production. That balance between the two things was put together as the two factors that were important to being successful as a leader. Now, remember here, what was measuring success? Measuring success was the final outcome of the organization. Was the organization doing well? Wasn't looking at other things, but it was looking at primarily if the organization was achieving its goals and objectives. That's important for us to understand as well. So then the Michigan study, Michigan University study here brought up the other one here: task-oriented behaviors, relationship-oriented behaviors, and participative leadership. So again, they tried to what in essence these behavioral theories tried to do was basically try to identify one or two or three different key elements that made leaders the way they were, or try to explain why some leaders were successful or others weren't. And the problem that early behavioral approaches had was that they were trying to explain a situation that was very, very complex, but by oversimplifying it. And that led to sort of like the behavioral theory becoming a bit problematic. And as a result, the research that they conducted was really inconsistent and inconclusive in terms of what they ended up doing. So, as I said, early behavioral theory really they were now starting to scratch the surface of the thing. But because of the need to make it more practical oriented, you had to have 5 steps. It's sort of like that book we saw earlier on, Seven Secrets of Highly Effective Leaders. I did that program, and I can tell you it's it's a highly complicated. It's not 7 steps. Let's put it that way. Each step is a whole host of different substeps that you have to look at. And they try to make it kind of like a cookie cutter approach to things. So it again, behavioral theories were limited by that circumstance. So the next area was situational contact contingency approaches, and that really focused on the attention that the leadership, the way in which leadership operated was based upon the situation or the context in which the leader found themselves. And this started to bring up another concept that the circumstances in which you're trying to engage in leadership activity actually impacts upon the type of leadership that exists and the kind of things that will work. So it really was looking more as how leaders change from one situation to another, and what were the different kind of skills that were necessary in one circumstance as opposed to another circumstance. And the major finding coming out of this really was that the context of leadership really started to show itself as being seriously important in the consideration of leaders and how leaders operate. Because a leader in a business environment is different to leaders in social environments. And that is one of the things that this model, this approach tried to get to. All right, and somebody has a question? There's a lot of noise there. All right. Hello? Somebody's mic is open, is making a lot of noise. All right, so again, the most important thing that came up here was that the circumstance or the context in which leadership was taking place became critical, and that criticalness was another aspect that this approach discovered that obviously becomes incorporated into the newer models that we have today. So they actually came up with the least preferred co-worker model, which was in the 1960s. And it was really weird because, again, it had to do with the situation that you found yourself in. So if you started working, you had to deal with really bad co-workers, and what do you do and how do you deal with that situation? And then they came up with another model called the path goal theory, which I tried to identify the ease at which you are able to accomplish your personal goals as opposed to the ease at which the company can achieve its goals, and those two parts had to intersect with each other. So again, the context between personal and organizational context had to intersect, and the task of a leader was therefore to make sure that that intersection was strong enough to get the organizational goals accomplished. So that's again a different technique that they talked about, but was where they would start the position now. So these series started to look at the context and how and where your leadership is taking place. And of course, problems with that would be, again, lack of research, lack of clear understanding of the concepts, and collection of data that actually would support the findings or the claims of theories of this nature. Now you have the influence theories, and most of you all who did management should be familiar with Max Weber as one of the managerial gurus that arose in the history of management studies. And he positioned quite early in just before and after the World War II, the concept of charismatic management. And charismatic management, we already met the charisma issue, and what Weber talked about here was that the success of a leader was based not on the power or the authority of the individual. Sorry, excuse me, but rather on how people responded to the person, which had to do with their degree of charismatic appeal. And it really, I mean, charismatic leaders have always been something that people look to. For example, when people discuss Obama during the first election phase, they refer to how charismatic a person he was and his ability to speak and take people through and use good speech techniques to get a following and get people listening and engaging with him. And this charismatic leadership style that that appeals to people because then you seem to be able to influence those individuals, and that is a good thing when it works for good purpose. But it's also the problem is that charismatic leaders tend to impact upon people differently, and given what the individual is or who the individual is. I mean, a lot of people believe Trump is charismatic. I mean, he says what a lot of people want to see, and he says it in a manner that a lot of people want to, how they want to hear it. And it just means, though, that we have to be careful that charisma is not something that is a good indicator of the quality of a leader that you're going to have and the concepts that they're going to look at. So again, we have to pay attention to the fact that charismatic leaders tend to have problems. So this theory here had to do more about the influence of the leader on the group as opposed to the other way around. And the danger with charisma is that people respond to charismatic individuals in different ways. And of course, one of the things I think they believe too that charisma really works better in situations when there are problems. So like now we're looking for charismatic leaders to rise and help us lead us through this situation that we're facing. And also during times when there is a willingness to change the status quo, the way things are. So you see the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, is a situation in which people are challenging a status quo in a particular country, in the United States in particular. And it is quite likely that a good charismatic leader can the excellent time for charismatic leadership to kind of show up, at least from the Max Weber model that they're looking at here. But again, charismatic leadership is not the only type of leadership that exists out there. And this theory starts to say to you that charisma is not the only thing that is required to be a leader. So, and of course, we come back to the whole situation that charismatic leadership has had mixed reviews. You've had good ones and bad ones. So the next of the influence theories has to do with the reciprocal leadership theory. So this is coming out of the 1970s now. So we're moving on here. We have to understand the concept of what's going on in the 70s as well. The 70s is the decade of love and drug experimentation and dropping acid and stuff like that. So you had to kind of, it's also the period during which the Vietnam War and the protests were going on in the United States. So you have to kind of put that in context. But think about what was happening in terms of people's influences at the time. And here they were talking a lot more about reciprocal nature of leadership, the reciprocal nature between the leader and the follower. And therefore, these reciprocal theories started to gain traction because you started to realize that it can't only be about the person in charge, because the person in charge has to be accountable to the people that they are supposedly leading. And therefore they started to talk about that leader followership responsibility and motivation between two. They had to work together. And these theories started to try to describe the need for that reciprocal relationship between leader and follower reactions, and how a leader is held accountable to the followership, and how followership is accountable to the leader, and so on. And that essence of interrelatedness is one of the important elements in terms of these types of theories that came up. So of course, we just described that whole circumstance, that interdependence thing. And the other aspect of it is that this model started to speak to, or these theories started to talk about the need for leaders to empower their followers to be able to do things. So it's not about what the leader can do for you. It's about what you can do with the leader and what the leader helps you to become, in terms of your capacity to perform different functions. And this relational leadership models started to gain some traction there. There are three theories coming out of that whole thing: the transformational leadership theory, the servant leadership theory, and the followership theory. You're going to find that these theories kind of influence the relational leadership model that we're going to be looking at in the next chapter. So again, we have these three theories coming up. So this is the transformational leadership theory process, where a leader and followers raise one another to higher levels of morality. So this is the one that is asking for the reaction or the relationship between the two to help to modify and transform the organization or the individuals in that group to be able to do good things, to do high levels of moral and valuable things for society. So one of the things that starts to rear its head now in the transformational sets or the relational sets is the need to be looking at ethics and morals. And that brings a different dimension, because not few of the others really looked at that aspect of the leadership, the ethical values that these leaders had, and the ethical expectations and the moral underpinnings of how organizations work with their leaders. So these transformational, as one of the relational leadership models, started to look at the whole context of value systems and morals that developed leadership in the situation. So leaders and followers are intermixed. There's no way you can be a leader without followers, and followers would require leadership in order to get that guidance as to what they're doing. So it's not that things kind of just work where they are, that kind of stuff. So the key thing here is about identifying the importance of the relationship between the two and the moral compass that is being utilized to guide the actions of both. The concept also is about that transformation is to lead to change, and that's another important thing, is that this organization is working towards achieving a positive change in society, positive being measured by the ethical and moral standings of the thing. But the way in which you're doing it too has to be ethical. You can't just achieve your goal at any means necessary. That's basically what you're talking about there. You have to be concerned about the ethical values and the moral values that's going on in there. So these are some leaders who have been ascribed as transformational leaders. Most of you all should recognize the six here. This is John F. Kennedy. Remember, he had that whole thing: ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. That is that whole transformational thing. Mahatma Gandhi, he led India through to independence. An earlier version or American president is this gentleman in the corner here, Abraham Lincoln, who led them through the Civil War, or led them into the Civil War because of his stance on slavery. Well, the whole history looks at that situation as well. Then we had Martin Luther King, who was transformational in the movement of the social awareness that took place in the 50s into the 60s. I'll come back to this, because how many people recognize who this individual is here in the center left? Anybody? Everybody should understand or should know Teresa. Yes? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Right. Who's in the middle here?
I have no idea.
Anybody?
So I think I know him, but the name not coming to me. I know he's a U.S.
President.
person. I can't remember his name.
Right. So it's FDR.
Yeah.
President Roosevelt. FDR.
That's the guy. That's the guy. Yeah.
He was portrayed in Pearl Harbor. He had polio and he couldn't walk properly. He used to use crutches and a wheelchair. He's also one who took the country out of the Great Depression. And in order to do that, he kind of transformed how the United States kind of did business. So he led the United States out of the Great Depression of the 1930s or the 1920s, and also was a wartime president that led them also out through through World War II. So that's something that you have to pay attention to. So all of these leaders are considered transformative leaders. Of course, the last person I didn't talk about was Mother Teresa, who's led social change and consideration for how we perceive and what we do for the poor, the suffering, and that kind of stuff. So her work is especially transformational in the social movement towards eradicating poverty. So those are things that you want to look at. These are good examples of transforming leadership. So one of the things that they did was compare the transformational leadership model to the transactional leadership model, and those two models were, well, if you think about it, transform is to transform from one thing into another, encouraging people to make change, positive, and so on. But in terms of the transactional, the way in which you get transactional leaders work is through, if you do this, I will do that kind of thing. So it's a transaction. Is one better than the other? At the end of the day, the two techniques might get something done, but the way in which they're going to go about doing it is different. And you all actually have a debate topic that's set around this whole concept of whether or not transformational leadership is superior to transactional leadership. And really, at the end of the day, transactional is just a technique that can be utilized. And to say one is better than the other, it just depends upon how you present your arguments about that, really. But transformational leadership requires a lot more skills and a lot more developmental and inspirational type of activities than transactional, because transactional is simply, if you do this, you get this. We use transactions all the time. I mean, if you have children, you convince them to do things by making small transactions with them. If you do your homework, you'll get this. So if you wash the dishes, you'll get that. You make those little transactions. But transformational leadership requires, that you've inspired somebody to do something despite the fact that they don't want to do it. There's a huge difference between the two. All right. And again, it's just really going to be a matter of focus on what the end result is, but the methodology of how it's going to be done. All right. So critics of the theory focus on its overall lack of clarity and being specific. So that's a big problem with it. With most of these theories that we're going to be looking at, this is very inconclusive in terms of one thing or the other. Now, the servant leadership, this model follows the same relational thing. Talks about the relationship between the leader and the leader and follower. And what comes to mind here is to stoop to conquer, which is that phrase that uses that in order to conquer things or to achieve, you have to lower yourself to the standard of the individuals with whom you're working. In this case here, it really is the leader's job is to be the servant of the followers and help those followers transform themselves into the individuals who can make the change necessary. And that's a difficult place to be in, because here it's not a traditional place for, because a lot of leaders don't see themselves as servants to their followers. They see themselves above the followers or pushing them and pulling them along, as opposed to the servant leader is the one who leads from within and from behind and helps people to get where they're going. So that concept is one that you probably paid it. You may have seen in different different things. The boss is like, a diaper, always up, what, and full of what, as opposed to a leader is the person who would support you and motivate you and uplift you. They're two different types of leaders, and which one would you prefer to be? Now, this servant leadership model was one that has been attempted a lot, but it's difficult because to run it through, because you have to give up a lot of your power to be able to lead from a servant leadership theory, and that's one of the things that a lot of traditional leaders have problems. They don't like to give up power, but this style or this theory of leadership requires that you must give up your power to become more powerful. Just think about it from that perspective. But the first act of giving up your power to become more powerful is the part that they have most problems with. Because people perceive if you give away your power, you're giving up your leadership, which is not the traditional way of thinking about leadership. So the servant leadership theory is one that challenges a lot of the status quo out there and creates a bit of issue and problems for the traditionalist views that has um, existed in our society, especially in businesses, where it's not something that leaders are willing to give up their power to uplift and empower their employees. All right, so there are different people who have contributed to the development of this theory, and it's one that's, you see, 1993 is quite relatively new in terms of its conceptualization and development. So this is one of the theories that's going to kind of heavily impact upon the relational model that we're looking at. I mean, just from the name, you can probably start to see this kind of thing happening up there. So at the end, the goal is of the servant leaders for those who are served to grow, to become more knowledgeable and empowered, to gain interdependence or independence, and to become servant leaders themselves. So your idea is to make new leaders out of those persons that you've had working with you, and you are serving them to empower them. So your job as the leader is to make sure that these people who you're working with can themselves become great leaders. And if you're a traditionalist in thinking about leadership is about power and holding on to power and stuff like that, this system will not work for you at all. But it's one of those systems that has grown in popularity over time. The followership theory kind of follows with this, where followers might be traditionally looked upon as sheep. This is a phrase that's been used a lot now with Trump followers and this sheep thing nonsense that they keep on saying all the time. In the followership theory, the focus of the theory is not so much on the leader as it is the followers, because the followers of any organization or any leader help to define that leader and force that leader into doing things the way they want to do. So with this model, they flip the focus not on looking at the leader himself or herself, but to look at the relationship between the follower and the leader. And that's it's sort of like, turning things on its head a little bit. And therefore it gives more credibility to the concept of followership, and that followers play a more important role in determining how things are done in organizations because of their importance of forcing the leaders in. So it's a top-down model, as a sorry, not a top, it's a bottom-up model. So the base has more importance in the model than the top. And a lot of organizations try, well, most industries can't use this, but because it challenges traditional lines of control, and that could be a problem. But they did in terms of doing this there. We actually talked a little bit about this in the previous chapter about the different types of followers and the well, no, not the components, but the competencies that followers must have. So, I mean, you don't want to have, well, if you're a good leader, you don't want to have a sort of sheep and yes people, because those people will just simply do your bidding. But you want to make sure that you have effective followers who are critical thinking, independent, and those are important elements that you want to be paying attention to in terms of the nature of your followers. And of course, you don't want to have alienated followers. Now, that's something that you might find, an easy way for you to look at this is if you look at the election results of any country, there are generally going to be three categories of people: those who voted for you, those who voted against you, and those who didn't vote at all. Those people who didn't vote at all are the alienated followers. They don't follow anybody because they have been alienated by both sides of the organization. What you're looking at is what you're trying to do is to make sure that you don't end up with alienated followers, because if you end up in a circumstances where the majority of the people in your organization are not voting or not participating in your leadership initiatives, then you have a problem. You've done something seriously wrong to make that situation problem. All right. That is problematic in the sense that you obviously are not doing things that is encouraging people to become involved. So you're having issues with your followership. So most political parties should be looking at something along these lines, because a lot of them may be trying to encourage too much sheep and yes people, but not having effective followers. And that actually means that your organization is weaker as a result of the lack of these of your ability to get this done. So these are the qualities that effective followers usually have. They can self-manage, they're competent, they have high principles and stuff like that. So that goes on with the other ones here. So these followers look at themselves not as followers but as co-adventurers. That's a nice term that was utilized here. They have to be empowered, and again, this speaks to the leader empowering people to be better, to be able to make their contribution. And of course, one of the things that comes up in this is that they're going to be have to be very ethical in their decision making as well. So those are things that that you want to look at here. So another emergent paradigm. So those are the relational models. Another paradigm that we're going to be looking at here is moving away from the industrial paradigm. Now, that's one of the things that we've been always looking at. The vast majority of leadership theory has been designed around business activities and the industrial revolution. And that paradigm actually has to be switched off, because leadership is much more than just business. All right. So the paradigm that we want to be looking at here is, well, this is the traditional paradigm of the industrial era that we have to get out of. So it's very management oriented, very self-focused, self-interest, male oriented, materialistic in nature, technocratic, and that kind of stuff. This system kind of doesn't work well now, and simply because for another different type of reciprocal leadership theories that we talked about before don't work well in that type of paradigm or that type of overall structure. What we found ourselves looking at more and more is the fact that we are not facing the kind of structural or structured environment anymore. And for people who might be OCD, for example, they will have problems with the world that we live in today. I mean, we all like structure. We all like things to be done in a particular way and that kind of stuff, generally. And therefore, when things go wrong or they go out of kilt, we start our problems adjusting to it. But the leadership models that have been developed in the past have a tendency to be designed upon the concept that everything is in a structured environment. But the world around us now is not that way. And this starts to bring us into what we refer to as chaos theory. So chaos theory really accepts the fact that the new environment that faces us is not one that is clear cut and neat, but it is one that is made up of a lot of change, and that change usually brings a lot of problems with it, and we have to find a way to lead ourselves through it. So that brings us into the concept of chaos theories. That chaos theories therefore require a system or a model that allows itself to kind of to be able to manage a situation in a changing world like that. So chaos theories really speak to two things: that chaos in itself is a system. It takes us longer to see. They refer to it really as hidden patterns. So if you look at any sort of chaotic scene or apparently chaotic scene, there's order in that chaos. And the order is not a predictable order. But in that chaos, things live and things thrive. And what they're saying is that we would need to develop models in leadership that can work and survive in a model like that, or in a circumstance like that, in a chaotic system like that, and not only work but also thrive. And it requires a couple of things happening so that you're able to deal with the situation. So they refer to it as the quantum world, of thing. And what happens is that the solutions that you try to find for problems that come up in chaotic systems cannot be cookie cutter, one and done kind of stuff. And this is something that the leadership models had to start to kind of to adjust to. So the chaos systems actually start to look at things about, well, you see something called adness, right? This concept called adness. None of us are independent, so you have to deal with dependency on others, depend more on your relationship with others. And they refer to that relationship and the importance of that relationship as adness. It is you and I, or this and that, that gets us through this situation. So it's not about you alone impacting about things, but it is you and others, or this organization and that others. So that's why they refer to it as anding. You and something or someone has to do something to be able to deal with the situation. So that anding part of it is critical. So another phrase we could use now in our context is networking. All right, networks have become more and more critical for the survival of companies and survival of organizations and societies. We cannot operate by ourselves. We need each other's help in order to do it. So those are the things that you want to be looking at there. So they talked about also moving from right and wrong to more of a systems approach of both and not either or. So basically it's not about being right or wrong, but it might be right and wrong. So that might sound a little weird. So here you start to think you're going across to the one answer approach to something. What you might end up happening is that you might use two slightly incorrect or two wrong solutions to make a right, so to speak. So this is two wrongs don't make a right, but maybe two wrongs can make a partial right. And that's the concept that they're trying to say, that you're not going to find one solution for the problem, and you may not find any solution for a problem, but you might find partial solutions, meaning that part of the solution works and part of the solution is incorrect. So if you combine a number of these partially correct things, eventually you might get something that can help you deal with the whole thing. And that requires us kind of stepping away from the systems that we've become locked into. of the, it's either right or wrong. No, it's not right or wrong. It's gray, right? It's shades of gray. It could be right. It could be wrong. Maybe this aspect of the thing could work, but together with another aspect, you get a better result. So the solutions to things is going to be not just one idea, but multiple ideas that make up thing. And then that's a couple of the characteristics of the chaos theories that have come up to say that we have to be a little more flexible overall when it comes to looking at these things. All right. As I say, most problems facing communities are difficult and don't have simple answers, and therefore, if you have a number of different approaches, you can probably get a solution to a complex issue that is not going to just come from one source, but from multiple sources. Which is why, in chaos theory, relational theory plays an important part, because leaders would need to empower followers from different aspects of different disciplines and ideas and thinking to be able to pull together a complete solution to a huge problem that you're having. So, like global warming, for example, global warming is something that there's no one answer. It has to be a combination of different approaches to try and get this one problem dealt with. All right. And they talked about here chaotic worlds, or chaos theory says that there's a self-organizing system that if you observe the world around you outside of the human world, the rest of the world manages their situation. Yes, things die and whatnot, but that whole situation, the environment, kind of self-corrects. And we have to be looking at how can we stop imposing our needs for a systems approach to things and allow the chaos to help develop the system that we're. Now that means giving up a lot of control. So this chaos systems requires that leaders are really flexible. And it may sound vague, as they say here, it sounds nebulous, but I mean, they ask you to think about the behavior of participants in your group when you are dealing with a situation. So you all are going to be put into different groups and different classes that you have, and you have to find a solution. There's no one right way to do it. It's a bit chaotic and sometimes, and therefore what you can do is try and develop a little chaos theory system around. In fact, you're probably already dealing with that. Okay. And see where you stand with that whole thing. So the last model that the relational thing dealt with is authentic leadership. And this is a type of leadership that really focuses on leaders being authentic, and their authenticity is really going to be sitting upon understanding the importance of ethics and moral values. And that's going to be basically the key to this authentic leadership. Lots of aspects, but the key about authentic leadership is about authentic people becoming leaders, and authentic people being leaders, and they are authentic all the way through their lives. So it's not a matter that an authentic person can just emerge overnight. Somebody has to be working on themselves to be authentic all the way through. And that's where this authentic leadership comes from. So, and you realize this comes out of the 2000s. So an authentic leader is someone who is confident, hopeful, optimistic, resilient, transparent, moral and ethical, future oriented, and gives priority to developing associates to be leaders. So you realize there's a whole lot of things that you're asking for an authentic leader to be. And it's a number of different things in terms of their ability to do things, as well as all of the different informations that they're putting together. I mean, that's a huge load to put on a leader. Can they be this way? And the thing about it is that, yes, there are people like this. Can any of you all think of a leader who's confident, hopeful, optimistic, resilient, transparent, moral, ethical, future-oriented, and gives priority to helping develop the skills and abilities of their followers? Can you? Any leader comes to mind that fills this particular position? Well, nobody. Unbelievable. Can't think of anybody from a historic point of view.
So leaders come to mind, but not everybody who possess like all those traits that are listed. They may have some unlocked others.
Well, and that's
Here's Obama. I don't know.
yeah. Obama might fall into this kind of leadership model. Yeah, he would fit this kind of stuff. And the thing about it is, the one thing that they say about the authentic leader is that this authentic leader has been somebody who has been showing these characteristics all the way through their lives, and not just now coming up and appearing like this, but always having a track record of this thing, and development like this through the life of the individual. So one of the things they talk about is that authentic leaders just what was it? At the very basic core, they were talking about authentic leaders can't be faked. That's what they were talking about, and that followership is right. So an emphasis on development. So again, it just goes on to describe the same kind of transparency, openness, trust. You'd understand that now the leadership models really are really focus more attention on the importance of the moral standing of the individuals that you're dealing with. So these things are going to be critical for us understanding all of this particular model. So again, the authentic leadership model is going to impact heavily upon the relational leadership model, which the next chapter is going to look at. So you see here, authentic leaders do not fake their leadership. You can't fake being an authentic leader. An authentic leaders are originals, not copies. So again, it's not that you can copy yourself. Well, you have to always be this. You have to walk this walk all your life. It doesn't mean that you're going to start off as being an authentic leader, you know. But what it means is that you can trace the development of a person who emerges as an authentic leader, kind of thing like that. Because that's what the model is going to tell us about in the future. All right, so these are all the different leadership models that were developed, and this authentic leadership has a lot of traction these days because we see really good examples of the leadership we don't like. In the next chapter that we're going to be looking at as well, we're going to focus on. So these are the things I kind of put into the chapter summary there. We're going to focus on. We're going to focus on the chapter 3. Yeah. All right, from current slide. All right, so chapter 3 is actually going to focus us on. This is chapter 2. I'll close that one for now. Anybody has any questions on this one before we kind of go to chapter 3? Anything they wanted to get to ask for clarification purposes? Right. Nobody? All right. So I want to give you all about what time we have now. 1:20. No, we're going to run a bit late today. Just letting you know. But I need to get about 5 minutes. Was that okay with you guys? I need to check on something that's been going on outside my room.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah. Let's take about 5 minutes.
No problem, sir.
All right. Okay. When I come back in here, I'll turn off on the camera. Okay. Actually, no. I'll need to stop the recording as well.